Hello everyone. Welcome to our webinar about technology, education, and the digital divide. We first like to thank you for joining our webinar, taking your time to join this webinar, and we really believe that this webinar can be a valuable time for you. It took a bit of time to get set up, and there might be a bit of technical difficulties as you move on, but please do stay patient with us, and we're certain that this webinar will be very, very useful for you. But before we dive right in, we'd first like to introduce ourselves, the presenters of the webinar. Hello, my name is Sang-wook, and I'm a grade 12 student at Jakarta Intercultural School. Our service club, Plugged In Service Club, has been working for the last 4 years on the issue of digital divide. And it's so amazing to now think about the problem of digital divide, the future of education, and also the future of technology in education.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me here. I'm Sia Hong, a freshman. I'm going to my 4th year in GIS, and I'm so excited to be here since this is my first time.
Hi, I'm Gary Zhang, and I'm a freshman. I've been at GIS for 8 years already, but this is my first year in the Plugged In Club.
Great, thank you for the introductions. Now, there will be a time in the end to ask questions to our keynote speaker, Professor Sugata Mitra, and you are free to send out questions even starting right now. As you're joining through our website, you can simply scroll down and fill out the form one time or multiple times, and then we will review the questions one by one. We really hope that this webinar can be a very interactive one, so we encourage you to ask questions, whether you are a student, parent, or an educator. So for the next hour or so, we're going to explore the following 3 questions. What is the future of technology within education? How do students learn best? And finally, what can students do, the young generation, to help close the digital gap? Before we welcome the keynote speaker to the stage, we'll briefly explain why we're considering 3 questions together and not one by one. It is our belief in our service club that these 3 questions are inherently linked and also more relevant than ever in today's world. The first question explores education and technology, which are becoming more and more inseparable in our lives. If we just consider the fact that for the last 2 years, schools have transitioned to online learning, we can feel the importance of technology. It is no longer supporting, but rather shaping how education looks in the world. As many countries try to get back to what we call normal education, we now must try to reflect on the role of technology. What will it stay with us? In what ways will it shape our education in the future? And importantly, should we innovate technology to improve education, or is it time to innovate education itself with the current technology? These questions are all relevant in the current world, and these will be explored in today's webinar.
As we consider the 2 things together, the second question serves as the anchor. How do students learn best? Although this could be interpreted in numerous ways, good education will understand how students learn, not just what they should learn about. For instance, maybe you learn best in quiet environments, or maybe you learn best with a group of friends.
The third and last question concerns the current status of the world. What can students do to help close the digital gap? 2/3 of children in the world do not have regular access to the internet, and here in Jakarta, the pandemic has forced millions of students to stay at home without any way to attend school online. Even if they can, many of them use small smartphone screens without meaningful social interactions. The future of education must reach everyone in the world. As we said before, education should be equitable and universal for everyone, no matter their income, nationality, their gender, sexuality, and more. But unfortunately, a good education is not accessible to everyone but just a few. So our purpose as a member of Plugged In is to spread awareness of this gap and work to close this gap as much as possible by using technology.
Great. So, as we consider the future of education we want to build, perhaps all of these three components must be considered together and not separately. Education must be innovative and work with evolving technologies and not avoid them. Effective education also understands how students learn best and maximizes their potential. And finally, we cannot call it truly the future if education is not universal and shared by everyone. So, considering these three questions, we are ready to move on to the next slide.
As we introduce these topics to you, now we would like to welcome Dr. Sugatra Mitra onto the stage.
Hello, and good evening. Um, I I was planning to use some slides, but then I decided that maybe what I have to say is perhaps easier understood if I just talk rather than show you things. Um, it's actually a very simple kind of a message, and I hope you will enjoy it. Uh, let me start with a very simple observation. You know, a lot of people talk about going back to normal. You know, particularly in education, in colleges, in universities, in schools, people say, when we go back to normal. Uh, I want to question that because you can't actually go back to anything. You can only go forward, as we all know. I mean, you know, it's whatever time it is in your country right now. I think it's about 9 o'clock, and uh, you can go from 9 o'clock to 9:10 or from 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock. You cannot go backwards from 7 o'clock to 6 o'clock, right? So you can't go back. And then there is this whole idea of normal. So what do we mean by normal? Well, normal school means that you go at a certain time, you meet all your friends, etc., and you go and sit inside a classroom and somebody tells you things. You listen, you make some notes, you memorize what was said or the summary of what was said. And then after a few months, there is an examination. And in the examination, they try to find out, do you remember what you heard? Unfortunately, they don't actually ask you, did you understand what you heard? They mostly ask you, do you remember what you heard? So as a result, you could come out of school and university having remembered a lot of things which you heard over the years, but perhaps not understanding all of it as well as you ought to. So maybe when we go forward into the new kind of education that we are invariably going to have, we should focus more on the understanding. That is really what I want to say. But to start with, where did all this come from? It came from a very small experiment done many, many years ago. Many of you were not even born then. Back in 1999 in India, I had tried an experiment. You know, there were many children who had never seen a computer or heard of the internet. So what I did was I took a computer and put it in the street. You can't put it in the street, so I put it into a wall. So that experiment got called the hole in the wall. So children would pass by and they would stop and they would start fiddling with the computer because there was nobody else around. Nobody said that you can't touch it or whatever. And we saw very quickly that they taught themselves how to use the computer. Now, this is not new to any of you. Anybody who has seen a child, a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old child with an iPad knows that nobody has to teach them how to use it. But back in 1999, this was not known. So people were very surprised. Oh, you don't have to teach them how to use it? No. And what do they do once they have understood or they've learned how to use it? Well, the children started searching for things, using a search engine, started searching for all sorts of things. And people said, oh, well, they may be able to search. That's very clever, but they won't understand what they're looking at. So I started asking the children some simple questions, what is that screen trying to say? What are you looking at? And I discovered very quickly that they could actually understand what they were looking at. Question was, how? How could just street children do this? The answer turned out to be very simple. When children work in groups of 4, 5, 6, then their capability to understand is a lot more than if they are alone. And as students, you would know that. Let's say, suppose you are studying chemistry, and there's a particular topic, and 4 or 5 of you are sitting around the computer looking at that topic. Would it not be easier for you to understand what it is on the screen if your friends were with you, rather than if you were just alone? It's as simple as that. So what do you need? You need the internet and you need a group. Simple. I took this idea to England in 2006 and started experimenting with the schools in England and discovered very quickly that if you give children, little children, 8 years old, 9 years old, if you gave them a few computers, not lots of computers, so if there are 20 children, if you gave them, let's say, 4 computers or 5 computers, and then ask them a question, then they start huddling around the computer, obviously, because there are only 4 or 5 computers, and they start searching, looking up things, discussing with each other, and always they would come up with a good answer. We call this a self-organized learning environment. And then I thought, well, but who will ask them the question? If it's just street children or the children in a tribe somewhere, who's going to ask them those good big questions? And I thought, well, I can get people to come over the internet and ask those questions. I recruited a whole lot of hundreds of grandmothers, retired school teachers, and asked them to come over to beam themselves, in those days using Skype, into a remote place, ask the children a question and say, okay, I'll come back in 1 hour's time. You figure out the answer. A combination of being able to search by themselves and given a good question seemed to produce good learning. I thought, well, this is wonderful. This is so simple. We gave it a name. We called it a self-organized learning environment, or a SOLE, SOLE. So why self-organized? Because nobody is telling the children what they have to do. They just form their own groups. They do whatever. They argue with each other, much as you would do when you're outside the classroom and you're all studying together in somebody's house or something like that. You're free. You don't feel scared to ask questions, to say, I didn't understand anything, or this is very boring, or whatever. So they would do all of that, and we called it a self-organized learning environment. Then people said, but there's a problem. You know that the internet can be dangerous. It can be, it can have misinformation, fake news, all kinds of things. And also, there are so many websites where children really should not go, or even students should not go, because they're not good. And everybody was afraid, particularly all the grown-up people, or the parents, or the teachers, and said, "Oh, this is not a good idea." You know, I discovered something else. On my street side computers, we never noticed any misuse at all. I thought, what's going wrong then? Why does everybody think that something will go wrong? And why isn't it going wrong in my case? You know what the answer was? The answer was very simple. If the screen is visible to everybody who is passing by, if the screen is big and it is clearly visible, nothing ever goes wrong. I thought, oh, so the problem is with the little screens, you know, those tiny screens. The problem is with that. Why? Because nobody can see what's on the screen. And secondly, you're not in a group, you're alone. So I got a very simple rule, okay, and all of you should remember that. Internet is safe on a large and publicly visible screen. That's all. Then, then I looked at, then the years passed, and many teachers began to use this inside their classrooms. They would give the children a few computers, ask them a question. Instead of telling them things, they would ask them things. You're students, you understand what I'm saying. That if instead of teaching a topic, if I were to just ask you, you find out and tell me, then these days, because of the internet, it's really easy. Then people said, but the children may not pay attention. And I thought, why would that happen? Why would children not pay attention? The answer to that was that children or students don't pay attention to things where they don't understand why they are studying that. For example, in a mathematics class, let's say that you're teaching trigonometry to children. And you say, children, today I'm going to teach you trigonometry. And not many people will be very interested because, first of all, they don't know what trigonometry is. And secondly, they don't know why they should be taught trigonometry at all. But instead of that, if I were to ask them, how does your smartphone know where it is? When you say my location, it shows you on a map where it is. How does it do that? How does it know where it is? I gave this problem to a set of children in China many years ago. And I left them alone for about half an hour, and they came back and said, it uses something called GPS. And I said, oh, what's that? And they said, it gets its signal from towers. So it looks for the nearby towers, and sometimes it looks for a satellite. And if it can find 3 of them, then it knows where it is. And I said, well, that's amazing. But I'm intrigued by your finding. Why only 3? Why not 2? Why not 1? Why not 40? And they said, no, it has to be 3. And I said, okay, find out why. Another half an hour passed, and they said it has to do with triangles. There's a subject called trigonometry. It uses that. And I knew that my job had been done. Do you see what I mean? Of driving the learning process with questions rather than with answers. So, can we teach a whole curriculum in this way? Well, I think we can. Because look at any subject on the planet, any subject at all. Did it not start because people had some questions to which they were looking for answers? and the whole subject developed. So, whatever we teach in school and college is actually an attempt by humanity to answer questions. And that is at the heart of what I'm saying is the new way to learn because of the internet. Why could this not have been done earlier? Because you couldn't have carried your library and your books and your teachers all with you all the time. So you had to learn everything just in case you need it. You had to keep it inside your head. But you don't need to do that anymore. Now, your smartphone carries all your teachers, all your books, all your libraries, the answers to all your questions. You just need the ability to find the answer quickly and accurately. How do you do that? Well, that is what you should learn in school. How to look for an answer, find the correct answer, understand the answer, and communicate it to other people. It happens by itself, which is the amazing thing about it. If the question is sufficiently interesting, nobody loses interest. Everybody goes for the answer. It becomes like a great big quiz show. So, we should not teach people what they can learn by themselves. That's obvious, isn't it? I mean, why would you want to teach somebody something that they can learn by themselves? Well, let them just learn it by themselves. And my experiments show that groups of unsupervised learners can learn just about anything by themselves if they are allowed to access the internet. So, what is it that education is all about today? The new education that we should head towards should focus on only three competencies: computing, the ability to search the internet correctly; comprehension, the ability to understand what you searched for; and finally, communication, the ability to tell other people what is it that you found. That's all we need to assess. If any learner can do that, it's okay. So again, if you are a student of chemistry and I ask you, do you know the structure of benzene? Well, in the old system, the system in which I grew up, the only acceptable answer was, yes, I know the structure of benzene. But today, that situation is different. Today, according to me, the correct answer would be, I don't know the structure of benzene, but I can find out in 5 minutes if you give me my phone back. Will that ever be acceptable to the education system? We don't know yet. So my suggestion is that we should allow the use of the internet during examinations. Just think about it. You have an examination, you have maybe 3 hours to answer 20 questions on a particular subject. It's just like before, except for one difference. You're allowed to use your smartphone. You can look up websites, you can do WhatsApp chatting, you can call people. You're allowed to use your smartphone. When I made that suggestion, everybody said, this is very foolish. They will all cheat. And I said, well, if looking up things on Google is cheating, then everybody on the planet is cheating all the time. That doesn't make any sense. The thing is, can you look up things properly, correctly, quickly enough to answer the exam? Then they said, oh, but everybody will get very high scores. So we did an experiment. Actually, this experiment was done very recently in Israel. And we found that this is not true. Everybody doesn't find the answer. The good learners find the answers faster than the poor learners. It does measure exactly how good you are. So if you allow the internet during an examination, you're not going to get any substantially different scores from if you had not allowed. The only thing is that everybody will be less stressed. Finally comes assessment. How do you assess a student? Well, instead of giving them an exam, you could just sit across the table and ask them, do you know chemistry? Do you like chemistry? Do you understand organic chemistry? Do you understand inorganic chemistry? Etc. etc. And then give them a grade. You don't test for memory, you test for knowledge. And this is actually done. If any of you are PhD students, you'll realize PhD is the highest degree we have, right? But in that highest degree that we have, what is the method? You are given a question to which no one knows the answer. You have to find the methods yourself. There are no restrictions. You can use any method you want. You research the subject and you write a thesis on it. You don't have to sit for an examination. You sit across the table for a verbal examination where the examiner simply tries to find out, have you understood what you're talking about? If that method can be used for our highest degree, why can it not be used for the rest of education? Conversation with a teacher can provide an accurate assessment of learning. That's about all I had to say. And there are 3 or 4 books that I have which explains all of this in a great deal of detail. You can find them on Amazon, on the internet quite easily. So I hope all of this made some sense to you. And maybe we have time for just a few minutes for some questions. Um, I will go over to the chat box, or maybe Sangwoo can coordinate this.
Great. So we're going to move right into the Q&A. Please provide us just a few minutes to get the questions sorted out. Thank you so much for the inspiring presentation about how students learn and what we can do as students to better learn and really continue what we should call good education. Now we are ready to move on to the Q&A section. Just to remind you, you can ask questions by filling out the form available just below the video on the website. And please do indicate your name if you would like to ask any follow-up questions so that we can know which is which. So in addition to the amazing presentation, we really believe that the Q&A section can be very useful and very productive and constructive. So it may take a bit of time to write down the questions, so we will now go for a short 2 to 3 minute break so that you can grab water or write down the questions, send multiple questions, or stretch your legs and arms. But do stay with us because Q&A session will be just as amazing as the presentation. All right, welcome back everyone to the stream, and I hope that was a good break. And we're now ready to ask questions. So before the webinar itself, there were a lot of great questions asked by both students, parents, and also educators. So before we go into the live questions, we will ask a few questions that were asked before. So the first question will be by a student. Just a moment. So the first question is, do you think any school systems have already implemented this system of understandings rather than memorization? What aspect of the system's design has allowed this? This question was asked by Karina, a student.
Well, that's actually quite an interesting question, and the answer is in two parts. First of all, as I mentioned, the PhD degree in universities has always used this method. They probably didn't realize that they were using this method, but they have always used this method of asking a question, the student or the learner figuring out the answer, telling or communicating the answer to a panel of experts who evaluates whether they have understood. So at the top of our educational pyramid, our highest degree, the PhD, follows this method. But after all my experiments, another lot of people started using it. These were schools, particularly the primary schools all over the world, including quite a few in Indonesia. Why only the primary schools and why not the secondary schools? Well, because in the secondary schools, the focus is on the end examination. And the method that I just told you about doesn't make sense because in the examination, you're not allowed to look at anything. You're not allowed to talk to anybody. You're not allowed to look at your phone. So, what good does it do? As long as our school examinations focus on memory, this system will not apply to secondary education. But teachers like the approach. So they use it for children who are below the ninth grade. So from grade 4 to grade 9, children in many, many schools around the world have been using self-organized learning environments. And I'm happy to tell you that most of them on Twitter and on Facebook will say that they got exactly the same results that I did more than 22 years ago.
Great, thank you for the answer. And now we're ready for the next question. This next question is again asked beforehand.
What would you say is your biggest challenge in setting up the hole in the wall project?
So, well, there were actually many challenges. The first of them were simply technical. How do you keep a desktop computer, normal desktop computer, how do you keep it running on the streets? Wherever you are, just think of what is outside on the pavement and think what will happen if you put a computer out there. Well, most places in the world, it will just disappear, right? So our first challenge was how do we make the computer available? Anyway, that was an engineering problem, and we solved it by, embedding it into walls and covering it with a glass pane and all of that. All of that is described in the scientific literature. But after that came the second problem, which is a much more difficult problem. Parents and other grown-up people did not understand what was the purpose. And many still don't. Many will still say Professor Mitra's method simply enables children to play games all the time. Because they think that if you are given a computer and allowed free access to a computer, all you will do for the rest of your life is to play games. But I think you know that that is a very stupid idea. That doesn't happen. You will use the computer for chatting with your friends. You will use the computer for looking up things. Every day, you will learn more than you did the previous day. But people don't understand that. And that continues to be the biggest challenge we have in the hole in the wall and the self-organized learning environments project.
Right, our next question is asked live. This is actually a teacher asking this question. How is the prospect of online schools in the future?
Well, you know, what I have been trying for all these 22 years to convince people about, quite unsuccessfully most of the time, suddenly got done by the virus. What I couldn't do in 22 years, the virus did in 2 years. Okay, it changed education. Everything went virtual. You must realize that today, you know, I'm talking to you from England over a medium, which 2 or 3 years ago you would have said, oh, that's never going to work, and you know, he'll never come, and our students won't log in, and so on and so forth. We changed. All of us have changed. We know now that this is our main method of interaction and communication. When schools closed, they had no option but to turn to the internet. When that happened, then parents, what did they say? They said, okay, but you know, it's not good enough. Not good enough for what? Well, not good enough for giving lectures. But why would you want to take a new medium of communication and use it for an old purpose? The mistake that teachers made in the beginning of the pandemic was to try to set up classes over the internet, over Zoom, and it didn't work. Imagine if you had a car, you know, an automobile, and you wanted it to behave like a horse-drawn carriage. It's not going to work, is it? So, so that is what the teachers tried in the beginning of the pandemic. And they quickly realized this is not working. Students are not paying any attention. They're not logging on, and so on. I kept telling them, look, the answer is very simple. Don't lecture. Just ask them a question and ask them to talk to each other over the internet and tell you the answer. Many, many teachers understood and used that. But unfortunately, many others didn't. What they said was, oh, but they will cheat. But the thing is, what does cheating mean? Does talking to your friend mean cheating? Then you're cheating all the time in your life. So, you know, it doesn't mean anything. The real issue is, can I ask learners a question to which they don't know the answer, and perhaps even I don't know the answer, and then together we figure the answer out. This is the heart of the new method. Will it happen? Well, I have a feeling that it has to, but only time will tell.
Thank you very much for the answer. That's amazing to hear about the future of education for students and really realizing that the future isn't about lecturing and really about asking them questions, the interesting questions. And perhaps this next question is also quite interesting. One student asked, do you think people will ultimately spend more time in metaverse than real life?
Well, this question has been asked, you know, for many media. Do you remember there was a time, I don't know, you may not remember, I remember there was a time when my grandmother used to tell me, don't read too much. You're reading too much, always with your nose inside a book. You should not, you should be in the real world. Then came radio. Then everybody said, "Oh, don't keep sitting in front of the radio all the time. You should be in the real world." Then came television. This you guys will also know. And all the mothers said, television only for 1 hour every day, no more than that. Not sit in front of the television. Hey, you must be in the real world. And then came the internet, and everybody said, oh, that's terrible. It's not the real world. You know, that meta universe, that network. No way. You must be in the real world. Until the virus came, shut down the real world. And we were left with only one thing, the metaverse, as you call it. I wrote a little book about it, you know. Can you think about this? That during these pandemic years, what would have happened if we didn't have the internet? We would have gone mad. Or we would have all broken the rules and gone out into the streets. And many, many, many more would have died. The internet stood between us and the virus. It protected us. And it gave us a new world to live in. So I wrote this little book. It's called Virus versus the Internet. So the answer to your question, will we spend a lot of time in this world? We don't have to make a distinction. This is a part of our world. One part is physical, the other part is virtual. We choose how much time to spend in which part.
The next question is by an educator.
Has your research been conducted to the research done on grit or growth mindset?
Well, you know, it is, I don't know what you mean by connected. I mean, there's a lot of published work that I have. I tend to, uh, if I suggest a method, I tend to test it, measure it, and then publish it in a peer-reviewed international publication, because that is the method of science. There are many alternative methods, but I don't see them publishing. You know, you can get a games manufacturer saying this game will improve your mathematics, and I would ask them, have you tested it? Have you published the results? And no, they haven't done anything like that. They've just taken 5 children and given it to them. The 5 children said, oh, it's very cool, and they said, this is fine. So is it connected to the research on grit or to growth mindsets? In an indirect way. That's all I can say.
Great. The next question is also by an educator, which might be related to the traditional schools and also thinking about the future.
So the question is, what are your thoughts about the age and subject traditional groupings and we currently have in schools, and are they efficient or not?
Oh, difficult question, but a very important question. Thank you for asking that. You know, this whole idea of curriculum, of subjects, and these have been traditionally developed from the Industrial Revolution. You know, this whole division between the arts and the sciences. Then within the sciences, the physical sciences, chemical sciences, logical sciences. And as we saw, once again, the virus shows us, where is the boundary between genetics, chemistry, and physics when it comes to the structure of how viruses work? There isn't any. You need to have a grasp of all three. So my answer to your question is, it is an administrative convenience to put subjects into boxes. But as a teacher, we don't need to stick to those boxes. We need to do, and I will repeat myself again, we need to raise the big questions. For example, is there water on the moon? How much water is there? If there is water, how would we release that water and use it? To answer that question, you need physics, you need geology, you need chemistry, and you need access to a lot of recent space data. It breaks the subject boundaries. It's a tricky thing to do for a teacher, but I can tell you that it is also a very interesting thing to do.
Great. Thank you for your answer about the asking big questions. And I think it's very, very relevant in today's world. And I think we do have a time for just one more question. And actually, a parent asked this question: how can you foster genuine curiosity while operating in an education system that rewards outcomes over process?
Well, this is, I would have said this is my question to all the educators also. But there is a partial answer which has come from the teachers all around the world. Do it while you can. If you are a parent and if you have children, do it while you still can, which is, according to me, until the age of about 12. Allow their curiosity, their creativity to flourish in every possible way. Encourage the internet, sit with them with the internet, ask the big questions, do all of that. Why stop at age 12? Because between 12 and 17, the formal system will grab them and will make them memorize. Will that system change? I hope it will. But while it doesn't change, you have no option. So should you do the fostering of curiosity? Yes, of course you should. Should you do it all through? No. If you're a teacher, stop at year 9. Wait for the formal system to get over, to get their, what you call their outcomes. Once you've got the outcomes, you can tell them to forget about it and get back into the way they were when they were 9 years old.
Thank you very much for your answer. So that wraps up the Q&A section. Thank you again for students, parents, and educators for asking amazing questions. And now we hope to move on to the last part of today's webinar. All right, so before we end the webinar, we do hope to talk about our service club's case in dealing with these issues and thinking about the future of education. We believe that our progress so far could be just one example of how students can tackle the issue of digital divide and also empower digital education. Because so many people still do not have access to even the smallest smartphones or computers. So since the COVID-19 pandemic, we launched an initiative to support students in Jakarta, Indonesia. They needed smartphones, tablets, and computers to study online. So we reached out to communities and corporations to donate old electronic devices, so as well as financial support. So with the funding and all the devices received, we repaired the devices and then finally distributed them to students and organizations in need. I think the great thing about this system is that the more you distribute, the better you can promote your initiative, creating this cycle where you can continue reaching out, continue repairing, and continue distributing to students in need. So it is our hope that similar campaigns like this can pop up in different communities around the world, and also continue discussing about how students learn best and how technology can impact education so that we can create even better solutions and better ideas to solve the problem. So that marks the end of the webinar. Thank you everyone for joining today and hope this webinar was useful. Thank you.